I think the Aces coming in at the lower seed is almost a different energy as well. I think they love to ride that feeling of like, we're being underestimated, we're being overlooked. What can we do next? And I think you have to keep that mentality if you are the two-time defending champion, if you want to have that edge going into a game like this against New York. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's first edition of The Late Sub. That's right, you have heard that correctly. We are making a scheduling shift and going twice a week. That is right, more women's sports news and analysis coming your way. We are going to kind of trick this out a little bit, trying to see how it goes, but the idea is with so much exciting things happening in women's sports news, we just didn't think that once a week on your audio feeds was enough. So we're going to be having shows on Tuesday and then on Thursday to hit on great things like NWSL playoffs, regular season, WNBA playoffs, and all the other good stuff that's coming up as we near the end of 2024. Today, we are going to be digging into game ones of the WNBA semifinals and all of that good NWSL action. So let's dive in. Okay, so I think there's no better place to start than the WNBA playoffs. We had game ones on Sunday of the semifinals. These are blockbuster semifinals between the top four teams in the league that have kind of consistently been those top four teams throughout the season. Maybe you look at the Aces and they've made a little bit more of a push, but game ones in these semifinals are very, very important. So we go from a best of three in round one to a best of five. Still kind of truncated. You don't get a lot of time to kind of get popped and then kind of come back from it. You don't see a lot of those comeback series as being won a lot in the WNBA. In fact, ESPN said after the games on Sunday that the team that wins game one of a best of five series in the WNBA is 77% more likely to win the actual entire series. So you maybe look at a game one and you go, oh, it could go one way, it could go another. These teams are still kind of figuring out what they look like in the playoff structure. We're seeing some different rotations. I'll talk about that in a second. And it's fine. You just go back, you win game two. And that is true. But you also, in a best of five, really have to come out with your best foot forward. There's not a lot of time to react in the WNBA playoffs. So in our first series of the day, we had New York playing Las Vegas. As everybody knows, it's the rematch of the 2023 WNBA finals. You've got 2023 league MVP Breanna Stewart versus 2024 league MVP Asia Wilson. It doesn't get bigger than that. It really, really doesn't. New York defeats Las Vegas 87-77 on Sunday. Stewie scored 34 points in the win. Sabrina Ionescu dropped 21 points. Kelsey Plum for the Aces had a very good game. She played 24 points in the loss. This game was, I think, very, very interesting, and we'll talk about that in a second, about sort of what these two teams look like at this moment. People are very excited about how the Aces have kind of been rising through the season. People have been very impressed by how the Liberty have been very consistent throughout the season. What does that look like in a short-form playoff series? In the second game of the day, we had Connecticut earning a road win against Minnesota, 73-70. So this was a very, very close game. Very close game. A very defensive matchup where you saw some of these new signings for the Sun really shine. We've been talking about Marina Mabrey constantly in these playoffs. She's been a revelation, maybe, in just that we're finally seeing a player of her stature, probably much closer to her ceiling than we ever saw her in Dallas or in Chicago. She scored 20 points, sinking 6 3-pointers to give Connecticut the road win. Now, the road win, that's a big, big deal. If Minnesota is able to split that, if they're able to win game two, that other game in Minnesota, we know this will definitely go to 4, which makes a big impact too. We have 2 home games, 2 away games for the higher seed, which is Minnesota. And then Alyssa Thomas was kind of just doing what Alyssa Thomas does. She has 17 points, 10 rebounds, and 9 assists. So almost another playoff triple-double for Alyssa Thomas. So like I said, big players, big teams, big matchups. But what does this all mean, right? More of a reaction just into these games ones, and then later in the week, we're going to talk about what it looks like in game twos, because I do expect adjustments, because you got to make them if you're going to make it in the playoffs. So New York versus Las Vegas, a lot of history there, right? A lot of energy. You saw it at Barclays in Brooklyn. You saw like Spike Lee sitting courtside, giving Sabrina Ionescu that energy, chipping it up with Kelsey Plum. There was a big kind of New York moment, I felt like, for the Liberty in this game. And I know that they had great playoff support last year, but it just even feels different this year. It almost just really feels like the Liberty's year. It feels like they have the whole city behind them, and they were rocking on Sunday. But you also, again, you look at 2023, you look at what the Aces did. Maybe bad blood is too strong of a word, but you're seeing kind of, I've really kind of been enjoying it in a way. You're seeing sort of these promos get clipped by different teams, different players, different coaches. You've got Becky Hammon still really pushing for Asia Wilson after she got unanimous MVP to also be considered for Defensive Player of the Year. Wilson did not get that. That went to Nafisa Collier. You have Hammon saying, that's crazy. I think the Aces always like to play with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They're supporting Tiffany Hayes. They think she should be Sixth Player of the Year. That hasn't been announced yet as of this recording. And they're coming in as the lower seed. And I think the Aces coming in at the lower seed is almost a different energy as well. I think they love to ride that feeling of like, we're being underestimated, we're being overlooked. What can we do next? And I think you have to keep that mentality if you are the two-time defending champion, if you want to have that edge going into a game like this against New York. But New York is also different than they were last year. And I think maybe the best way to look at that is to look at their depth versus last year. New York, as everybody knows, they compiled this super team last year, and it almost felt like they were doing it in sort of this direct response to what the Aces built through the draft. Now, the Aces are not technically a super team because they built through the draft rather than primarily through free agency signings, especially now that they no longer have Candace Parker on the roster. But the Liberty kind of built some of it through the draft. That's how they get Sabrina Ionescu. But then they sign players like Brandon Stewart, like Jonquel Jones, like Courtney Vandersloot. Last year, it took them as far as the finals. This year, they wanted to take them all the way to a title. And they built depth throughout this offseason, and we're seeing the dividends of that. We even saw it during the season. They were without Vandersloot for a little bit, and they didn't miss a beat. They were out without Benijah Hamilton for a little bit, didn't miss a beat. And the playoffs are when that shines, because the playoffs is going to be true for all four of these teams. Playoffs are when rotations get tighter. Connecticut and Minnesota both played 7-player rotations in their game. Las Vegas played 7 plus Sydney Colson. It was basically a 7-player rotation, plus they had kind of 4 minutes for backup point guard Sydney Colson. But New York played with 9. And I think that matters kind of in small ways to even just sort of back up what the big stars were doing, because I think you can just look at those big performances and say, star players make plays. Brandon Stewart scores over 30 points. That's that. But you look at kind of the flexibility that New York has going into a game like this. And they, in the beginning of the postseason, even in that Atlanta series in round 1, they benched Courtney Vandersloot, who had been starting for them, and people might remember was starting for them last year in the finals. They start Leonie Fivich, who has been, if not Caitlin Clark, if not Angel Reese, truly one of the best rookies of the entire season and what she's been able to bring to the New York Liberty. I keep joking, she kind of looks like Sloot. I'm like, they've cloned Courtney Vandersloot, except she's taller and she can shoot threes regularly and she's German. So they have these options and they're able to work other players in to tire the Aces out. And that also means that New York is able to facilitate their length a little bit more. Stewie is a very long player. Jonquel Jones is a very long player. And both of those bigs can shoot and put the ball in the hoop. And I think ultimately, when you look at just this game, that is the big killer for the Aces. They had Kia Stokes not score any points in this game. The guards played well. Asia Wilson played well. But if New York is getting points out of 9 players and Vegas is only getting points out of 6, that is going to, at some point, cause fatigue in your starting, that sort of core 4, and it's going to make it difficult to win a 5-game series. New York is able to double. They're able to double Asia Wilson. There's only so much she can do. They don't have to worry about some of the other scoring threats, and Vegas has to figure out how to make them pay. And again, I think when you talk about that energy, right, it looks like Stewie is locked in, Sabrina Ionescu is locked in. These players want to make it to the top of the mountaintop. So I am expecting an Aces bounce back, and we'll be back to talk about game 2 later this week. But I think Wilson is going to have something to say about this series. I don't think you can keep her contained consistently through 3 games, right? She's going to have to take the team on her back like she has kind of all season. And I think also the other option, and we saw this at the end of the 2023 finals, is, maybe you double Wilson, you try to shut the guards down, and you look at the rest of the roster and you say, okay, it's time to step up. It's time for your other bigs to score. It's time to maybe get Megan Gustafson some minutes so that you have a different rotation with your taller players and kind of match that length that New York has. Or maybe you ride on guard play and you say, okay, you're going to shut us up inside. We're going to light you from outside. So I think that they have options and they have the ability to adjust, but also I think at some point stars make star plays. Asia Wilson is going to have to kind of take this team on her back in game 2, I think. Moving over to Minnesota versus Connecticut. That was the first road win of the 2024 playoffs, which is what the Sun was able to do in Minnesota. Thank goodness. Too many higher seeds doing too well in this playoff series. Connecticut looks really good. And that Marina Mabry trade has them looking more balanced than ever. Again, 6 threes. That's just not something that Connecticut they had going into this season. They were not shooting threes regularly, and they make that midseason trade. Having that boost, especially in the fourth quarter, because they had to make a little bit of a fourth quarter comeback to win this game, That's huge. But the thing that also kind of gets in the way of the Lynx is not maybe the new look of the Connecticut defense, but the old look of the Connecticut defense. It's the exact same sun that they've always been. Yes, Mabry has been a huge part of how they've been able to play. Dejanay Carrington, even just stepping up her game defensively, has been a huge part about how they play. But they're able to disrupt the Lynx offense. And the Lynx were having trouble. You see these long possessions. I mean, as everyone saw, 73-70. That's not a high-scoring game. It's a lot of defense. It was a lot of possessions that played out for the entire shot clock. And then you try to get the right switch to the right players so that the Lynx are able to combat how tall Connecticut is, because this is a bad matchup in terms of length for the Minnesota Lynx. They are not as tall as the Connecticut Sun. And so if you're not dealing with Alyssa Thomas on defense, then you've got Duana Bonner. Or then if you get switched off of Bonner, you've got Bree Jones. Like, it all makes a difference in how Minnesota is able to move. Because yes, Nafisa Collier, Defensive Player of the Year, she's had an incredible year. She's able to score. But those matchups do not favor her. And Minnesota kept looking for switches to be able to make that offense work, that kind of high-flowing attack. And it didn't always happen because of the way that Connecticut was playing defense. So I think you look at the big picture, right? You look at Connecticut kind of leaning on their defensive identity and the fact that they have physical matchups that favor them. And then you also see that added element of Marina Mabry to close the game out in the fourth quarter. So how does Minnesota get back into this? Those switches. I do think you're going to have to do it. You're going to have a lot more deceptive movement. You're going to have to try to switch on. They were mentioning this on the broadcast consistently. Like, are going to want to try to get someone like Dejanay Carrington switched on to Nafisa Collier. You're going to want to get those matchups that allow your performance players to perform well. You're going to want to see Courtney Williams having to hit from the mid-range. And then you're also just going to have to keep forcing the Sun into tough shots. And I think that's kind of the intangibles of this particular matchup. It's going to be a grind. It's going to be defensive. These are two very good defensive teams. But who can make the plays? And as everyone saw with Marina Mabry hitting it from the logo, or even AT hitting that killer midi to ice the game, you need to force those players into those tough shots and force them to make them. Now, maybe they do make them and you just get flat out beat, but you have to keep making Connecticut's offense uncomfortable at the end of the shot clock and hope that you can turn that into turnovers rather than those sunk shots. So game 2's on Tuesday. Very, very excited. Again, like I said, these are two very talented and very well-coached teams. Again, you see that same thing on the Liberty versus the Aces. Cannot wait to see the adjustments in game 2. But before we move off of WNBA, I did want to leave a quick note here about a team that is not in the playoffs. This is another big storyline from this week, end of last week going into this weekend, was that the Chicago Sky fired first-year coach Teresa Weatherspoon after narrowly missing the playoffs with a roster that featured 2 rookies in the starting lineup and a number of high-profile trades both before the season and mid-season. I did just want to take a note on this personally because I am based in Chicago. I've picked up the Chicago Sky as one of my coverage rotations. I went to quite a few Sky games this year. I spoke to Teresa Weatherspoon. I was in the room with her before games, after games. I didn't talk to her as much as maybe some other people, but I was there maybe after wins. I was there after losses. And I thought Cheryl Swoop said a really good thing on her podcast this week, which is that she was just talking about Spoon and talking about how it's part of the unfairness of this dismissal is that it doesn't really feel like there was anything Spoon could have done other than not be a first-year head coach to save her job, which is a failure on the Sky for their expectations based on who it was that they hired, right? And so I guess I just want to say that I very much hope that Teresa Weatherspoon finds her way back into coaching at whatever level. I saw the growth in her, even just, you talk about media. Media is not always the most fun part of the job in the WNBA or in any professional sport. Sometimes you don't want to talk to the media after losses. Sometimes you don't have much to say. Sometimes they're asking you questions about things you don't want to talk about. And I even just saw how Spoon grew into that throughout the season and how attentive she was. She's one of the most present people I've ever met in my entire life. And how she was able to learn even just that part of the job and grow into that part of the job from the beginning of the season into now. And so if that's what I saw from the outside, just kind of a sliver of what that growth was from Teresa Weatherspoon, I have to think that all those other aspects will also come with time. And I hope she gets that chance because I think that the Sky, much has been said about kind of the dysfunction of revoking someone in that role after having so much trouble with your roster. But I just wanted to say that as someone who did actually get to speak with Spoon this year, that even just the growth that I saw in one season was incredible. And I very much hope that she returns to the Dubs sometime soon. Switching over to NWSL, Another big NWSL weekend had another fabulous top 4 matchup between the Kansas City Current and Gotham FC. They share the spoils 1-1. You see Orlando continue this ridiculous, not even unbeaten run, but just another really good win against the Houston Dash. You saw Washington turn it around after that tough game against Kansas City last week. A lot of really nice things. I want to kind of just touch on sort of the big moments, and we'll get into maybe some more analysis and big picture stuff later in the week. Definitely want to shout out Temwa Chawinga, who has got Golden Boot pretty much wrapped up at this point. She has 17 goals on the season with 4 games to go. She is only 1 goal away from tying Sam Kerr's single season scoring record from 2019. Obviously, 2 would break that record. I keep saying this. I want 20. I don't just want 19. I want 20 goals on a season, and I think Chawinga can do it. Want to shout out exactly how that goal occurred. They were down 1-0 off of kind of a rough concession in the first half. We'll talk about that in a second. Chawinga takes the ball off of, it was a really nice pass forward off of defending a defending corner kick, as we know that can turn into counters so quickly in the NWSL. Chawinga carries the ball across the entirety of the field. Poor Neely Martin is running her butt off trying to catch up with Temwa Chawinga. She can't do it. You see the pain in her face. Chawinga rounds the keeper, calmly slots it home. I know I have talked about how Chawinga's speed is such an asset, but I even just watch a goal like that and I think, man, not to use a basketball term, but I'm like, her handles are so good. The ability to kind of calmly round the keeper like that, and the way that her movement is deceptive to get separation before even realizing that she's gone. Just an incredible attacking performance, not only this weekend again, but this season. I hope everyone is enjoying the tactical level and the performance level that we're seeing from attackers in this league. I just voted, actually right before recording this, I just voted for team of the month for September. And I always just think to myself, I'm like, I could put 6 forwards in this team. I don't, you do it positionally, but it's been such a good year for attacking talent. And so it's incredible to me to see a player like Chawinga even just sort of set herself apart in terms of being able to earn those goals. Again, that game, I liked the game. It was in Kansas City. I always feel like these things are kind of previews for the playoffs, right? Because you have that hard-earned draw, and then you go, well, eventually that's going to have to turn into a win or a loss, right? Kansas City's big thing here, and I do want to shout this out because I do think that it could be a problem for them in the future when they do move into the playoffs, and you really don't want to concede the way they conceded this goal. They go down early because I don't even want to say because it felt like there were 2 things that happened at once. You had Michelle Cooper kind of bump into referee Koroleva. Koroleva does not stop play because Koroleva did not touch the ball. I am on Koroleva's side on that. She did not have to stop play. It was unfortunate, but it also was not devastating. It had been a half of turnovers. Both of these teams execute press as well. The ball was getting turned over in dangerous spaces already. You can't shut off in that moment. Gotham recycles the ball. And you see this moment for Kansas City, which is, I think, not really a symptom of the confusion of that moment with Koroleva, but more a symptom of their entire season, which is just that they're not very good. I want to shout out Jason Anderson, who writes for Pro Soccer Wire, because he was the person who pointed this out to me, but it's true. They struggle with dead ball situations, like actual literal dead ball situations. They concede on set pieces a lot, but that also includes like wave 2 attack. So if you yourself are in stasis because you're ready for like wave 2 attack coming into your own defending third, that counts. And you saw their struggle with that in a very, very weak goal conceded to Gotham. Now, I do think the comeback was very, very impressive. Again, shouting out Chawinga in that. And I actually think running that sort of simulation of what you do when you do concede a goal like that was very, very impressive from Kansas City. I think they probably would have wanted all 3 points, but not terrible to come back and get the draw. But I thought that was just sort of like, that's everything Kansas City is, right? They sometimes struggle with dead ball or wave 2. They're going to have to consider that when they go into playoffs, but they also always have a shot because they have a player like Chawinga and the ability to find her. I think the other major story out of the weekend, probably, if not, Orlando doing so well or Washington turning things around or that really nice match that North Carolina played against Chicago, is the Thorns. I mean, I keep doing this. I don't even know what to say anymore. I've said it so many times. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you have heard me say the Thorns is kind of this war of attrition. It's this death by 1,000 cuts. They have not won a regular season game since July 5th. They lose 2-0 to San Diego this week. They've been without Sophia Smith for 2 games. That obviously doesn't help, but this is the permanent manager, permanent GM. They sit 7th in the standings at this point, and I am almost at the point where I go, maybe they need a crash out moment. I don't wish it for the players. I truly don't. I think that the players deserve to play in the playoffs, and I think you always want to have a team like Portland in the playoffs and a fan base, and they have such good talent. Like the roster has such nice dynamic players, but the players are not playing to their best of their ability. It doesn't feel like they're being set up to succeed. The gaps are wide where they do have weaker players into certain positions that are fairly important. And then you're also just seeing, I think at this point, sort of a mental block. And so I am very curious. The Bethal family I've mentioned, they have just invested in a WNBA team for Portland. They have just bought the Thorns. what kind of team do the Thorns want to be in this new era of the club? And I do just wonder if we are not at the point where maybe they need to be bold and do the wholesale change moment rather than kind of accept the fact that they're in the running for just being above the playoff line, which I know for them historically is not good enough. Couple shout outs I also want to hit. I keep mentioning Orlando, another very impressive game from them, though they were obviously playing the Houston Dash. So it was the top of the table versus bottom of the table. Have to take that into consideration. But I think the thing I want to shout out for Orlando is not just the performance. Obviously the performance was great, but they got over 17,000 fans at home in this match. I think they said it was the second or third highest attendance in Pride history. I think it was the highest attendance that they've ever had in that particular stadium. I just want to shout out Orlando's staff, and I want to shout out the fan base and the players. We've discussed ad nauseum sort of this. It's not worst to first for the Pride, but it feels that way in the context of the greater history of the organization. They were not a very good team, probably from like 2018 on, right? They had troubles with stars leaving or maybe not making the right signings or being too high. I mean, one of their major issues starting out was they were just too high on the salary cap, so they really struggled to fill out the team with the stars to support players like Alex Morgan or players like Marta. And right now they're the best team of the NWSL, and they are arguably having one of the best seasons in NWSL history. And that team deserves a fan base. And those people in Orlando, those fans in Orlando deserve to connect with that team. And that doesn't always happen right away. That takes work. It takes effort. It's hard to get the word out sometimes, especially if someone has in their mind's eye perhaps who that team used to be. I loved seeing that from Orlando. I hope that they continue to pack the stadium for the rest of the season, because what they're doing is not only historic, but it deserves to be the foundation of something really, really impressive with that fan base and the connection that the club has with the community. And then my final NWSL shout out for the week is I want to talk about Bay FC. Now that's my big riser. I talked about sort of some of the losers of the weekend, right? Talk about maybe Chicago. They had a tough game against North Carolina. You're always wondering, like, is Chicago just destined for 6th or 7th without being able to really push into that top 5? I think that answer is pretty clearly yes. You look at Portland, who's losing their grip on that top half of the table. You're seeing a team like Racing Louisville, who still is just really struggling to give above that playoff line. You're looking at Seattle, who took another loss. You're looking at Angel City, who took another loss. But the big winner here, I think, is Bay FC. Everyone needs to keep an eye on this team. I keep saying this, that they're not really the same team that they were at the beginning of the season. They get a 1-0 win over Seattle. It's off a penalty, so maybe no huge, like, flashy fireworks. But I think that's the whole thing with Bay FC, and I think that's why they're kind of sneaking up on people. Like Rachel Kundananji, who was one of their major signings at the beginning of the season, has probably had her best month in the NWSL in September, despite not necessarily racking up goals or assists. She's been so good in her movements to open things up in the attack. They make that trade for Abby Dahlkemper, right? That has really solidified the back line. You can see the leadership moments beginning to grow. Abby Dahlkemper, not only a very good center back, but also very comfortable at an expansion side, right? She was one of the cornerstone signings for the San Diego Wave when they went on to win the Shield last year. They only have 1 loss in their last 5 games, and I think they're going to make the playoffs. I think Bay FC is going to make the playoffs in their first season in the NWSL. And I'm very, very impressed by that. So if you had to, if you were looking at the standings and looking at the schedule and you're saying, okay, there's 4 games left, what kind of history are we chasing and what kind of games do I want to watch? Here's what's interesting to me. Number 1, can Orlando win out for the rest of the season? Absolutely. That's the big one. I think the second one is you always want to see competition between the top 4, and then the question of whether North Carolina can push into the top 5, right? That was a big win for them away from home. That's a huge step forward for them, if you recall this from last week's episode. I am a little bit less excited about the race for 8th, just because we're seeing a lot of teams struggle to form that identity to be able to make those big playoff pushes. But then I'm also saying Bay FC maybe must see TV. That's the team I would watch. That's the team that is going to hopefully kind of be that sneaky team that makes it into the playoffs and makes, hopefully, possibly, a late run into the postseason. So we're seeing things brewing in the NWSL. I'm getting very, very excited for the postseason, but I am very also interested. If you look at the Shield race, maybe the Shield race is about wrapped up, but it's Orlando chasing history, right? You've got maybe Portland figuring out how they're going to make it back up into that top half of the table. And then Bay FC. That's the team I would watch. So that has been our Tuesday edition of The Late Sub. Like I said at the top of the show, you're going to be hearing from us later in the week to talk WNBA Game 2s. We're very, very excited to roll this out. We want to stay on top of the news cycle. Don't want to miss a single thing. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Follow us on Just Women's Sports, all of our Just Women's Sports social channels, and the Just Women's Sports YouTube channel. And we will see you a little bit later this week.